38 million kilometers. That's approximately how much new fiber optic cable China added in 2023 alone, according to data from China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. Think about that number for a second. The Earth's circumference is roughly 40,000 kilometers. 38 million kilometers of fiber means enough cable to circle the planet about 950 times. Infrastructure statistics are usually boring. This one isn't. Because when analysts compared that single year of Chinese fiber deployment to what the United States has added over the last 2 decades, they found something uncomfortable. China installed more fiber in 1 year than America has managed to deploy across many years of broadband expansion combined. The obvious interpretation is that China wants faster internet. That's true. It's also the least interesting explanation. Fiber optic cable isn't just internet infrastructure, it is industrial infrastructure, economic infrastructure, military infrastructure, AI infrastructure. The same strands of glass carrying Netflix videos also connect factories, data centers, ports, financial exchanges, logistics hubs, power grids, research laboratories, and increasingly, artificial intelligence clusters. A country laying fiber at this scale is not merely improving broadband access, it's wiring its economy for a different future. And that's where this story becomes much larger than telecommunications. Because if you strip away the headlines, the trade wars, the semiconductor restrictions, the speeches about technological competition, what remains is a very simple question. Which country can still build things quickly, at scale, and across an entire continent-sized economy? The answer is becoming less comfortable for Washington every year. Consider a detail that received almost no attention outside specialist circles. By the end of 2023, China had built more than 3.3 million 5G base stations, not planned, not announced, built and operational. The United States took a different approach. American telecom companies focused on profitability, market demand, and shareholder returns. That isn't irrational. In fact, in a market economy, it's exactly what companies are supposed to do. The Chinese system works differently. Beijing's industrial planners don't necessarily ask whether a network investment generates immediate returns. They ask whether the infrastructure creates capabilities that become valuable later. Sometimes that leads to waste. Sometimes it leads to overcapacity. Occasionally it produces an advantage that compounds for years. The debate is usually framed as capitalism versus state planning. I think that's the wrong frame. The more useful comparison is between optimization and capacity. America has become extraordinarily good at optimizing existing systems. China's leadership, particularly since the launch of initiatives tied to the 14th five-year plan, has become obsessed with expanding national capacity. Those sound similar. They aren't. An optimized system extracts more efficiency from what already exists. A capacity-focused system keeps building. Even when the immediate demand isn't obvious, even when the economics look questionable, even when critics are laughing. And sometimes the critics have a point. There are Chinese cities with infrastructure projects that probably never needed to exist. There are rail stations with fewer passengers than projected, industrial parks that struggled to attract tenants. Anyone presenting China's development model as flawless is selling a fantasy. But there's another side to that ledger. The same country that occasionally builds too much also ends up possessing infrastructure that becomes useful years before competitors realize they need it. We're seeing that pattern emerge again, because fiber is suddenly becoming important for reasons that barely existed a decade ago. Artificial intelligence training clusters require enormous bandwidth between servers. Automated factories require low-latency industrial networks. Cloud computing depends on dense fiber connections between facilities. Advanced logistics systems consume data continuously. The infrastructure that looked excessive yesterday often looks insufficient tomorrow. Which brings us to the number I want you to remember: 38 million kilometers. We'll come back to it later because the length itself is not the most important part of the story. The more revealing question is where that fiber went. Not the major cities, not Beijing, not Shanghai. The real story starts hundreds of kilometers away from China's financial centers, in places most foreign analysts rarely discuss when they talk about technology competition. And that's where the picture gets much harder to ignore. When people imagine China's technology rise, they usually picture Shenzhen, glass towers, electronics factories, startup districts, engineers moving between Huawei, Tencent, and BYD. Reasonable image, wrong place. The more revealing locations are places like Guizhou, Ningxia, Gansu, and Inner Mongolia. These are not the provinces that dominate international business headlines. Some of them were historically considered peripheral to China's economic core. Yet over the past decade, they have quietly become critical pieces of Beijing's digital infrastructure strategy. The reason is surprisingly practical. Data centers consume staggering amounts of electricity and generate enormous amounts of heat. Building one in Shanghai is possible. Building thousands of megawatts of computing capacity there becomes expensive very quickly. Western China offers cheaper land, lower temperatures, and access to energy resources. But there was a problem. Computing power is only useful if information can move, which meant China needed something before it could build the AI economy it wanted. It needed highways made of glass. This was the logic behind the Eastern Data, Western Computing Initiative, formally launched by Chinese authorities in 2022. The idea sounds almost mundane. Collect data where people live along the eastern coast, process much of it in western provinces, and connect everything through massive fiber networks. Yet buried inside that bureaucratic language is something larger. It's an attempt to redesign the physical geography of China's digital economy. And physical geography matters more than people think. A software engineer can write code from anywhere. A nation-scale AI ecosystem cannot operate from anywhere. It requires power generation, transmission lines, cooling systems, fiber networks, semiconductor supply chains, logistics infrastructure, and a workforce capable of maintaining all of it. One missing piece creates a bottleneck. China's planners appear to understand this instinctively. The United States, by contrast, often treats these sectors as separate discussions. Energy policy is one conversation. Telecommunications is another. Industrial policy is somewhere else. Data centers occupy their own category. Capital markets evaluate each investment individually. Again, this is not irrational. American institutions were designed to maximize efficiency and returns at the company level. China's institutions increasingly operate as though they are optimizing for national capability. Those objectives overlap less than many people assume. Take a moment to consider what happened during the AI boom. When generative AI exploded into public consciousness after ChatGPT's launch, attention immediately shifted toward semiconductors. NVIDIA became one of the most important companies on Earth. Governments began debating advanced chips. Export controls became headline news, all justified. But something interesting happened underneath that conversation. AI wasn't just consuming chips, it was consuming infrastructure, lots of it. Every new data center required additional power, additional cooling, additional fiber, additional connections to other facilities. The glamorous part of the AI revolution was happening in software. The expensive part was happening underground. There's a dry joke hidden in all this. The future is being marketed with images of intelligent machines and futuristic interfaces. Meanwhile, thousands of workers are digging trenches and laying cable. Technology often looks less like science fiction and more like civil engineering. That observation matters because it exposes a weakness in many discussions about great power competition. Countries do not compete through isolated technologies. They compete through systems. A cutting-edge AI model depends on chips. Chips depend on fabrication facilities. Fabrication facilities depend on electricity. Electricity depends on grids. Grids depend on communications networks. Communications networks increasingly depend on fiber. Remove one link and the entire chain weakens. This is why the fiber story deserves attention, not because internet speeds are exciting, because fiber reveals something deeper about institutional behavior. Can a country identify a future requirement and build ahead of demand? Or does it wait for demand before building? Each approach has strengths. Building early risks waste. Building late risks scarcity. History contains examples of both mistakes. The United States actually understands this better than many critics admit. America's interstate highway system wasn't justified solely by immediate traffic demand. The project transformed economic geography for decades afterward. Rural electrification followed a similar pattern. Large investments often appear excessive before they appear necessary, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the fiber networks being built across China today are not primarily about current demand? What if they're preparation for demand that doesn't fully exist yet? I'm not entirely certain that's the correct interpretation, but the evidence keeps pointing in that direction. And this is where we need to return to the assumption many viewers are probably making. The assumption is simple. If China is building more infrastructure, then China must be pulling ahead. Maybe. The data becomes considerably more complicated once we stop measuring kilometers of cable and start measuring what those networks actually produce. Because quantity and capability are not always the same thing. In fact, one of the strongest arguments against the entire premise of this video comes from a place China still struggles to match. And if that argument is right, then the story we've built so far needs to be partially rewritten. Up to this point, it's easy to drift toward a simple conclusion. China builds, America debates. China installs infrastructure, America writes reports. There's enough truth in that picture to make it persuasive. The problem is that reality is rarely that cooperative. Because if fiber deployment alone determined technological leadership, China would already dominate every important digital industry. It doesn't, not even close. The United States still controls many of the highest value layers of the technology stack. NVIDIA designs the chips everyone wants. Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Meta operate some of the world's most influential digital platforms. American venture capital continues to attract global talent. The deepest pools of advanced software expertise remain concentrated inside the United States and its allies. That's not a minor detail. It's the central counter-argument. Infrastructure creates possibilities. It does not automatically create innovation. A 6-lane highway doesn't guarantee productive businesses along it. A fiber network doesn't guarantee world-leading companies. The strongest version of the American case is actually quite straightforward. China excels at deployment. America excels at invention. And for a long time, that was largely true. Yet there's a weakness hidden inside that argument. The distinction becomes harder to maintain when technologies mature. Early stages reward invention. Later stages reward scaling. The smartphone industry provides a useful example. Many of the foundational technologies emerged from American research institutions and companies. Yet over time, much of the manufacturing ecosystem concentrated elsewhere because scale itself became a competitive advantage. Factories attracted suppliers, suppliers attracted talent, talent attracted investment. A self-reinforcing loop emerged. Infrastructure wasn't the entire story, it became part of the story. Remember that number from the opening, 38 million kilometers? The significance was never the cable itself. The significance is what that number implies about execution. Laying that much fiber requires permits, labor, materials, financing, logistics coordination, equipment manufacturing, local government cooperation, and national planning, all functioning simultaneously. The cable is evidence. The capability is the story. And this is where the reversal appears. The real competition may not be about who possesses the best technology today. It may be about who can absorb tomorrow's technology fastest. Those are different contests. A country can invent something revolutionary and still struggle to deploy it widely. Another country can lag initially and then scale with remarkable speed once the technology becomes commercially useful. Historically, both patterns have occurred. Look at electricity. The invention mattered. The nationwide deployment mattered too. Look at automobiles. The breakthrough mattered. The roads, fueling networks, repair systems, and manufacturing ecosystems mattered as well. The winners were often the countries that combined innovation with implementation, not one or the other. This is why I find the current AI conversation strangely incomplete. Everyone is discussing model performance. Far fewer people are discussing deployment infrastructure. Training a powerful AI model is difficult. Embedding AI into millions of factories, hospitals, logistics systems, power grids, and businesses may prove even harder. That challenge rewards countries with dense digital infrastructure, and China's leadership appears to be planning around that assumption. There's a small but revealing case study here. In Guizhou province, one of China's historically poorer regions, major data center campuses began appearing years before global AI competition became front-page news. Apple, Huawei, Tencent, and China Telecom all established significant operations there. At the time, some observers viewed these investments as excessive. Why build so much capacity in a province that wasn't considered a technology hub? Today, the answer looks more obvious. The infrastructure was not responding to a trend, it was positioning for one. That distinction matters a lot, because infrastructure investments operate on different timelines than software products. An app can be launched in months. A nationwide fiber network can take years. A major transmission corridor can take longer. A data center ecosystem can require a decade. Countries that wait for certainty often discover that infrastructure doesn't care about quarterly planning cycles. It moves slower than politics and faster than public perception. One sentence from a former Intel executive has stayed with me for years. Paraphrased, the idea was simple. Manufacturing capability is difficult to create quickly and surprisingly easy to lose. I think the same principle applies to infrastructure. Capacity accumulates gradually, then one day everyone notices it. By then, the important decisions were usually made years earlier. Still, we should avoid turning this into a story of inevitable Chinese success. There are real constraints. Debt pressures exist. Demographic trends are unfavorable. Local governments face financial strain. Some infrastructure investments will never generate adequate returns. Those risks are genuine. But focusing only on those weaknesses creates another blind spot. Because even if a percentage of these projects fail economically, the physical networks still exist. The fiber is still in the ground, the data centers are still operating, the transmission lines are still carrying electricity, and that leads to a question that sits underneath this entire discussion. What happens if the future turns out to be far more infrastructure intensive than most Western policymakers currently assume? That's the question that matters, not because we know the answer, because we're about to find out.
There is a habit in geopolitical analysis that quietly distorts how people think. We tend to compare countries at a single moment in time. GDP this year, military spending this year, patent filings this year, chip exports this year. The comparison feels logical because the numbers are current. The problem is that infrastructure doesn't operate on annual timelines. It operates on decade-long timelines, sometimes longer. The fiber laid beneath a road in 2023 may influence economic outcomes in 2035. A data center built today may support industries that barely exist yet. An electrical transmission corridor completed this decade could become essential for technologies nobody has commercialized at scale. That's why I think many discussions about China and the United States are partially talking past each other. One side focuses on current innovation leadership. The other focuses on future deployment capacity.
Both are looking at real strengths. They're just measuring different things. And if we're honest, the United States has encountered this problem before. The country that built the Hoover Dam, the interstate highway system, the Tennessee Valley Authority, rural electrification networks, and the world's most advanced research universities did not become successful by choosing between innovation and infrastructure. It did both. At roughly the same time, that's what made the combination so powerful. Today's debate often presents a false choice, as though spending on physical systems somehow comes at the expense of technological leadership. History suggests the opposite. The most productive economies tend to pair invention with execution. Ideas need roads, software needs electricity, artificial intelligence needs data centers need fiber. The chain never really disappears, it just becomes less visible. Which brings us back to China's 38 million kilometers. The number itself is almost absurd. It's so large that most people stop visualizing it. That's understandable. But the more important observation is not the scale, it's the consistency. This wasn't a one-year burst followed by inactivity. For years, China has been expanding broadband networks, industrial connectivity, cloud infrastructure, power generation, transmission capacity, logistics systems, and manufacturing ecosystems simultaneously. Not perfectly, not efficiently in every case, certainly not without mistakes, yet the direction remains remarkably consistent. That consistency deserves attention regardless of one's political views. My opinion is fairly simple. I think many Western observers are still evaluating China through the lens of products, when they should be evaluating it through the lens of systems. Products can rise and fall quickly. Systems take longer to build. They also take longer to replace. That doesn't mean China wins. It doesn't even mean China is ahead. It means the scoreboard people are watching may not be the only one that matters. And there's a question I can't shake. What if the defining advantage of the next 20 years isn't having the most advanced technology? What if it's having the fastest pathway from invention to nationwide deployment? If that's the contest, then fiber optic cable becomes more than telecommunications infrastructure. It becomes a measurement of national responsiveness, a way of asking whether a country can convert ambition into physical reality. Because eventually every technological revolution leaves the laboratory, it leaves the conference stage, it leaves the earnings presentation. At some point, somebody has to pour concrete, dig trenches, connect substations, install equipment, and maintain the network. Civilization runs on those people. The future usually does too. My prediction is that by the early 2030s, analysts will spend less time arguing about who invented a technology and far more time measuring who can deploy it across an entire economy first. When that happens, a lot of infrastructure projects that currently look boring will suddenly look visionary. Others will look wasteful. We'll discover which is which soon enough. And that may be the strangest part of this entire story. The race everyone is watching is happening in AI models and semiconductor fabs. The race that might decide the outcome is being buried underground, one strand of glass at a time. If you enjoyed this analysis, send it to someone who still thinks infrastructure is a boring topic. It has a habit of becoming interesting about 5 years before it becomes essential. And by then, the cable is already in the ground.